Hi, I'm Andy Cleff.
And I'm Jenny Tarwater. We're both enterprise coaches with Agile Velocity.
We're going to have a virtual coffee chat today and dive into one of our favorite topics, the nuances and practicalities of, air quotes, doing Agile and being Agile. So I'm going to play the role of interviewer, Jenny, interviewee,
Sounds great.
flip the coin. I've got a handful of questions. Let's start with the concepts of doing Agile versus being Agile. What are the fundamental distinctions between these two approaches to Agile practice?
So I'm going to key into that last word that you said, practices, the Agile practices. I would say that there's a lot of folks that are doing Agile. They're doing the practices, right? They're managing their time boxes, they're having their events, they're doing big room planning, and yet they're not getting the benefits that they're looking for.
Hmm.
Right. And so part of the being agile part of it are the things that you can't see so well, that aren't necessarily the practices. They're things that are more internal to the individuals and the organization.
I love it.
Yeah.
So, as you touched on, a lot of organizations claim to be doing the Agile thing
Mhm.
by following these prescribed frameworks. Pick any name that you want, and the teams doing a subset of the scaling, whether it's Scrum or Kanban. How does this differ from truly being agile? And the what are the potential pitfalls of just going through the motions of a framework process?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I see a lot of conversations about these frameworks are evil, right? And they're anti-agile and things. And I frankly haven't met a framework I don't like, right? I think that there's benefits to all of them. There's some really great starting practices, right? I mean, if I were going to start anything new, I wouldn't want to start with no information and just kind of discover everything on my own. I want to learn from others, right? And so there's been lots of trials and experiments that have been successful, and I want to leverage those. So there's a cost of delay avoidance by using these frameworks. But what can be troublesome is if people say, okay, here's the 15 steps or the 10,000 steps that we need to take for a framework, and they're not thinking about the intent, or they're not thinking about why they're doing that or what benefit they're trying to achieve, right? So like let's take something that everyone's familiar with, like a retrospective, right? um if you do a retrospective and yet nothing ever comes from that, either we forget what happened in the retrospective or we have so much resistance to making those kinds of changes, then why have the retrospective, right? And I'm working with some teams right now, and they're like, we don't want to have retrospectives. It's a waste of time, and I don't disagree with that,
What
right?
they're what they're doing and calling a retrospective is a waste of time.
Yeah, yeah. So they're prioritizing their time for higher value things, and that makes sense. So what I get really curious about is what about the outcome of the retrospective or the system that they're in is so resistant to those improvements or those experiments, and kind of digging into that.
Yeah, I love how you framed up the framework, pun intended, that they come with a starter kit of practices, artifacts, ceremonies, roles. And then you touched on how oftentimes organizations go into a checkbox. Yep, we got the title, we got the ceremony, we got the events. How come nothing's improving? How come nothing's changing? And I think that's what you mean when you talk about being agile, right? Are there
Right.
specific steps and strategies to make the transition from reading the playbook to actually understand the intent and living it?
Yeah. For me, one is being very curious, right? So if there's a go do this kind of statement, and you go do this and it didn't make sense, and really say what that didn't seem to work for us. There may be something unique about your organization or the way that you work that it really doesn't make sense there, right? And it's a round peg in a square hole kind of thing. Or maybe the intent could be done in a different way. And one example I like to use is, we've all heard that when you raise kids, having dinner together is so important. All the research shows it. All the experts know that. My kid plays sports. We don't get to have dinner together every night.
Uh-oh.
It's not practical. So instead, we do things like spend Sunday afternoons together. So the intent of the family spending time together, decomposing your day, spending, time together and talking, we achieve that in a different way.
It feels like you have a wonderful family culture.
Very,
So I'm gonna segue that into the impact that organizational culture, and that is a very big thing. There's lots of subcultures within it. And I imagine that can play a particularly important role in shifting from doing agile, the checkbox mentality, to being agile. Do you have some more examples or some examples of how culture can either enable or hinder a transformation at scale?
absolutely. And again, like when we think about, I spend a lot of time, I over the last decade, I probably have had 1,000 different ideas of what I think agile really means. And that continues to shift. But I hear things like, well, the way that organization is working, that's not agile, right? I think that you can achieve agility. You can achieve degrees of agility within really any culture. You can't, however, achieve like the really empowered teams that are experimenting and making mistakes and failing fast and things in a culture that is very achievement based, very expert based, right? There's you get rewarded for things like saving the day or being the expert,
Right.
right? So that's different than a culture that says, hey, we want the team to work well together. And so we want to raise everybody up and share skills and allow people to take chances. Right. So culture definitely plays a part. And I think there's some calibration around what you're trying to achieve with agility and what the existing culture is. You may want to make some changes in the culture and such. And if you've got the leadership that can support that, I definitely think that's possible, but it takes time. And a lot of the friction that I see is when you're trying to achieve some kind of agile outcome in a culture that doesn't support that.
So you mentioned friction. Uh,
Mhm.
Other types of friction that we are all too familiar with show up as resistance and challenges, particularly in that downwards or bottom of the J curve, where they're moving through into integration and increased levels of performance. How can coaches help teams and organizations move through that J curve? What is
Yeah,
the WD-40, if you will?
right. So I like to make as much visible as I can and create that shared understanding. So there's nothing as kind of um, disorienting as continually being surprised and the target's continually moving and you not understanding why. And so I like to first of all set those expectations. Hey, y'all, things are going to get more chaotic than you might even expect before they get better, right? And lean into that. And what can we do to accelerate getting to those benefits and shortening the cycle of the chaos, right? And so we like to put together teams, for example, of folks from all over the organization, different levels in the hierarchy, if that's the thing, and in different kind of roles to help design the change and take ownership of it so that they can connect more with the folks in the organization, right? And so what we want to avoid is saying, hey, the leaders have gotten a bunch of agile coaches, right, to help the teams become more agile, but they're going to go off and do some other things while we do that kind of change work, right? So we really want the leaders to model the behavior that we're looking for, right? That we want them to say things like, we don't know, or we'll try, or it's okay to make a mistake. So bringing those kind of folks in with a wide swath of the organization, and helping to design and steer the transformation can be great.
Sounds wonderful. Well, that was my last question. Jenny, is there anything you'd want to add?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a balance, right? I can't imagine sitting around in a circle and just saying, what do we want to be? And like willing an agile organization into being, right? It doesn't work that way. You have to have this balance where there's a lot of good practices out there to try, having some knowledge of what might be useful to you, what problems you're trying to solve, and then really having the behaviors and the shared mission and shared values to do so. So that's what I consider that the Being Agile part is really the holistic view of what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing your insights. And thank you to the listening audience. If you like this, subscribe to our channel. You'll get an automatic notification when we put another episode out. Leave us a comment or a reaction on this episode. And if you have a topic you'd love us to cover, just jot it down in a comment. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.